Morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales, a comparatively young library that sits on the grounds of one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition belonging to the Gadigal people. I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us this morning. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks, and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the library, which means that I probably have one of the best jobs here. I get to look after the library's fellows and visiting scholars, and that involves, of course, our series of Scholar Talks. Now, I know I say every year, we've got a really special season for you this year, but this year is something a little bit different. This year, 2024, marks the 50th anniversary of the first advertisement for fellows. So back in 1974, the library printed the first advertisements calling for applicants to our C.H. Curry Fellowship. We had just one fellowship back in the day, but now we have a whole suite, and we have fellows and visiting scholars doing all sorts of exciting projects delving into our collections. So that's why today I normally come to you from a very austere public service cupboard upstairs, but this is the fellows room where our fellows and visiting scholars do most of their work. So I thought it was a nice touch to celebrate our special anniversary year by coming to you from the space where we do so much research into our shared histories. So launching our 2024 season and our 50th anniversary is Dr. Effie Karageorgos. Now, she's presenting on how to use the activist body during the Vietnam War and the different things and the different ways of protest. Effie is a lecturer in history at the University of Newcastle and was our 2023 David Scott Mitchell Fellow. She was working on quiet protest during the Vietnam War, with her research here at the library drawing on her extensive experience looking at the complexities of social history and conflict, and specifically Australian histories of gender, violence, protest, psychiatry, and trauma. But focusing specifically on the activist body and different ways people can protest is the focus of her talk today. Thanks so much, Effie.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm just going to share my screen. I want to say before I begin, now I hope that everyone can see. Oh, no, I'm sure that they can't right now because I didn't just share the screen. Okay. I just want to acknowledge first that I'm sitting on the lands of the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal people, and I want to acknowledge that these lands have never been ceded, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. I'm really excited about this talk. I've been really excited about this talk because I just really enjoyed my last year at the library. So I'm going to get right into it because I have a lot to say and I don't want to go over time. So when the United States first appealed to Australia for aid in fighting North Vietnam in the early 1960s, political leaders were already aware that this would face opposition from the Australian public. Activist groups and the religious left were prompted to protest Australian involvement in Vietnam from the 24th of May 1962, when the Australian federal government announced that an advisory group of military personnel, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, would be sent to support the United States. It wasn't until the National Service Act was renewed on the 24th of November 1964 that the general public began to speak out against conscription or the draft. More were motivated by the 29th of April 1965 announcement that combat troops were to be sent to Vietnam, and the March 1966 announcement that many conscripts would be obligated to serve in Vietnam. The youthful membership of the New Left proved key to activity against the war, but notably did not comprise the entire anti-war movement by any means. particularly after many leftist young men faced the draft themselves. Public debates on conscription began from 1964, including some who agreed with war in general, or even agreed with the Vietnam War specifically, but opposed the mandatory registration of young men to fight. And this led to a large number of anti-war and anti-conscription groups being formed across Australia, such as well-known groups Youth Campaign Against Conscription, Save Our Sons, the Draft Resisters Union, Vietnam Action Campaign, among many others. And while many groups were formed in response to the war, a large number of activists who were already involved in the burgeoning green, peace, gay, and feminist movements, as well as the religious left, among other groups, including students, teachers, academics, journalists, lawyers, and many others, redirected their energies to form a united front against the war and conscription. So prominent organisations such as the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, you can see this 1965 statement on Vietnam here. And Association for International Cooperation and Disarmament, the Union of Australian Women, and religious groups like the Quakers began campaigning against the war alone and alongside other protest organisations. Through my David Scott Mitchell Fellowship, I've been exploring the anti-Vietnam War protest archives in the State Library of New South Wales to try to capture the quieter ways people protested against the conflict in this state. And this includes what I call protest infrastructure work, such as gluing things together, handing out leaflets, preparing mail-outs, raising funds, as well as forms of protest outside the traditional rally or march. And what I found through this time is in the archives is, although many publicly took a stand against the Vietnam War, many kept their opposition non-public and non-confrontational. But as we will see, sometimes this still created confrontational responses by those who supported the war, and so they can still be viewed as impactful acts. It's important also that the various actions that comprise a protest movement cannot just be seen as quiet or loud, but that there is an entire spectrum from quiet to loud, and people's participation depends on their willingness or ability to get involved. My fellowship project merely aims to draw attention to that spectrum, to avoid underestimating the reach of social movements within Australian society then and now. So when I first offered to present today's Scholar Talk, I wasn't aware that I would be presenting this during a period where we've seen the most significant and fast-paced flowering of quiet protests since the Vietnam War across the country through protests about the situation occurring in Palestine. While writing this paper, some of which took place in the State Library of New South Wales on a Saturday or Sunday morning, where just a few blocks away in Hyde Park, there were weekly Palestine protests which had been held since October of 2023. And during this period, my social media and email was filled with examples of quiet protests that I had spent the previous year investigating. Oh no, why has this gone backwards and not forwards? Let me move it forwards. What's significant about what's going on now is that the massive mobilization of what we can perhaps call non-activists, so those more likely to engage in quiet protest, is taking place surrounding an international situation that does not militarily involve the Australian nation. Many quiet protesters in Australia became involved in activism during the Vietnam War because they objected to Australian youths being conscripted to fight. But this connection doesn't directly exist regarding Palestine, which is significant in the context of the place of activism and also humanitarianism in Australia, which is the topic of another very long paper that I don't have time to talk about today. The social movement theorist Alberto Malucci wrote in 1989 of submerged networks or hidden networks which, quote, become visible whenever collective actors confront or come into conflict with a public policy. He writes that it is difficult to understand the massive peace mobilizations of recent years unless the vitality of the submerged networks of women, young people, ecologists, and alternative cultures is taken into account. The central place of the social or collective act from the historian George Roudet's 1976 definition of protest means that Malucci's submerged networks tend to emerge into public view, which has occurred not only now surrounding Palestine, but also during the Vietnam War. And this paper is going to focus on the way that activist communities in New South Wales encouraged and made space for protesters to perform their objection to the Vietnam War using their bodies beyond the traditional rally or march. According to Barbara Sutton, Political protest is performed through the body as, quote, activists use and deploy their bodies in specific ways to achieve their political goals, end quote. While the unprecedented massive bodily presence during typical protest events such as rallies is key to understanding the impact of the anti-Vietnam and anti-conscription movements in New South Wales, this paper aims to broaden understanding of the ways that activist bodies were and continue to be strategically used as a text to communicate political messages. So this can include performances of opposition carried out both individually and collectively by anti-war recreational groups, including artists, so musicians, actors, dancers, gamers, writers, poets, and filmmakers. I found examples of all of these in my research. Here's one example, the Margaret Barr dance drama groups, 5 dancers at the Teachers Federation Auditorium, another example of how organisations sort of worked together and cooperated and helped each other. And this was raising money for the moratorium, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So public forums like demonstrations, theatre, public lectures, concerts went on throughout the Vietnam War in Australia. So I won't be focusing on these today. They're an entire separate lecture or lectures on their own, but I'll present a small range of examples by which bodies were used to intentionally create or promote the anti-war message outside the traditional rally or march. This took place by the wearing of anti-Vietnam War or anti-conscription materials, such as badges or armbands, as well as the presence of silent bodies in vigils or within courtrooms, and the absence of bodies strategically used to communicate dissent through walkouts and strikes. So it's a little bit of a collection of ways that people use their bodies, acknowledging that these are only a few of many ways, that very creative ways that people used their bodies to protest the war. The popularity of bodily activism during the Vietnam War, and in fact in all protest movements beyond traditional marching, or even the teach-in or sit-in, which also I don't have time, I could do another few lectures on that too, illustrates the need to focus on bodies as essential tools of social change. So I'm going to start by discussing the wearing of protest materials, which can include badges, stickers, jewellery, armbands, political clothing or other attire. Sutton writes in her analysis of Argentinian women's resistance that activists, quote, construct compelling images that attract media attention using their bodies. And she says that they move beyond the simple wearing of badges or clothing containing political slogans to bolder acts, including unclothing, illustrating the versatility of the body as a tool of protest. Badge wearing in particular was a method used by a range of protest organisations to raise funds through sales and spread the anti-war message. For example, the Union of Australian Women sold tens of thousands of badges throughout the war to fund their support of Vietnamese women. Bob Gould's Third World Bookshop, a centre of often more militant anti-war activity, regularly advertised their sale of anti-war badges and beads during the war. So badges were a relatively simple way to attract publicity, particularly when accompanied by the distribution of pamphlets or display of posters in public areas or even the traditional rally. Badge wearing was an ideal way to communicate the anti-war, anti-conscription message to the public in a non-confrontational way that required minimal effort from activists. As part of their study of activist wisdom, Madison and Skarma, Sarah Madison and Sean Skarma, interviewed academic and former National Union of Students and Union New South Wales worker Amanda Tattersall, who believes that badge wearing by supporters of protest movements are, in her words, a mechanism for broader understanding about the campaign. She also said that it allows people who are uneasy about protest to show their political stance without too much risk to themselves. So although the simple wearing of protest appears a relatively benign protest form, particularly in comparison with more direct, militant or illegal acts, here I'll discuss the strategic wearing of anti-war badges or other symbols alongside military adornments by ex-servicemen, before focusing on the dramatic response to moratorium badges within the New South Wales school system in 1970 and 1971 to illustrate the potentially subversive and impactful nature of wearing protest. So first I'm going to talk about briefly about ex-servicemen and how they wore protest. Although the movement surrounding Vietnam veterans against the war in the United States did not directly translate to the Australian context, the Ex-Services Human Rights Association of Australia, ESHRA, established in 1966, created a base for veterans of previous wars to demonstrate their opposition to the war. The historian John Puccini has written about ESHRA, and he writes that they devised an interesting way for anti-war veterans to use materials worn on the body to increase their visibility at public protests. Here's an example of the kind of thing that ESHRA was organising, lots of public meetings and other types of protest. ESHRA president and Second World War veteran Les Waddington made a point to wear his Return Services League, his RSL badge, while out in public, and ESHRA members who were also affiliated with the RSL were instructed to wear service ribbons, medals, or badges, as Puccini highlights. The ESHRA newsletter Conscience recommended on the 20th of June 1966, this is a quote, members should consider wearing a piece of black ribbon or a cutout black V for Vietnam in place of a badge to signify sorrow at Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and sympathy for all who are suffering because of the war. Members are invited to display this discreet sign of protest as they go about their daily activities. It can even be worn behind an existing badge, RSL, Scout, Rotary, etc. Such actions allowed veterans to express opposition to the war while attaching a veneer of respectability to protest, suggesting that wearing protest had an intended effect beyond the simple communication of anti-war messages. In this context, it was also intended as a public relations technique for the anti-Vietnam War and anti-conscription movements. ESHRA members were evidently aware of the broader impact that anti-war badges and other items worn on the body could have. The moratorium period from 1970 to 1971 in particular, when 3 large-scale Australia-wide protests were held that brought hundreds of thousands of Australians to the streets, and even more than that to engage in quiet protest, which I've discovered through my fellowship here, saw a concerted effort by protest organisations to ensure that activists used their bodies as texts to broadcast the anti-war message to a mass audience. In February 1970, the New South Wales Vietnam Moratorium Campaign released a list of suggested activities to their sponsors in aid of the first moratorium to be held on the 8th of May, which specifically listed the wearing of black armbands. It should be noted that in early 1970, the New South Wales Vietnam Moratorium Campaign was formed and then insisted on many others, and this happened in various states of Australia, and insisted that smaller groups be formed based in suburbs or even based around particular occupation groups. So there was a railway workers moratorium group, teachers moratorium group, which I'll talk about later, journalists, public servants. Public servants was notable because they were not allowed to protest the war, but that's another story. In February 1970, also, the Northern District's moratorium group based in Beecroft expanded this to include the wearing of black mourning chrysanthemums by rally attendees within a longer list of publicity actions. The Teachers Vietnam Moratorium Group agreed in a 25th of March 1970 meeting to ensure as many teachers as possible wore black armbands and badges during Moratorium Week of the 3rd to 10th of May, and particularly on 5th of May, which they had labelled Teachers' Day. The New South Wales Vietnam Moratorium Campaign Secretariat report sent to sponsors before the first moratorium of 8th of May 1970 combined many of these ideas, listing the tens of thousands of items created specifically to be worn by activists before, during, and after the rally. These included 15,000 self-adhesive stickers displaying the moratorium symbol, which you can see here, 2,000 buttons and 20,000 buttons and 20,000 armbands with the symbol and the words Vietnam Moratorium, withdraw all troops now, or withdraw all troops from Vietnam now, as well as 15,000 car stickers with the symbol and words get out of Vietnam now. These were sold at the Castlereagh Street VMC office, among other places. And badge wearing was so ingrained during the period that after a failed attempt by the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party to delay Friday sitting dates from the 8th of May to the 15th of May 1970, so they could all attend the moratorium, ALP politicians turned up to Parliament on the 8th of May wearing moratorium badges. I tried to find a picture of this, but I couldn't find one. I would have liked to share that. Badge wearing caused widespread controversy in a group of high schools in the moratorium period, which attracted the attention of the Teachers Moratorium Group, the State's Central Vietnam Moratorium Group, the New South Wales Teachers Federation, the New South Wales Department of Education, as well as the mainstream media. After all, students from high schools across the country and in New South Wales as well, as you can see here, were active during the war, particularly through the organisation High School Students Against the War in Vietnam. The most controversial events that demonstrated the real impact of badge wearing as protest occurred from April 1970 at Ibrox Park Boys High School, which was from 1976, Leichhardt High School, and then from 2000 Sydney Secondary College. And this involved the pressuring of both teachers and students who promoted the anti-war message by one teacher at the school, Mr. Caffrey, and the principal, Mr. Smith. Now, I should say that I'm now going to go into this sequence of events that didn't only involve Ibrox Park, but spread across many different high schools across the state and lasted from early 1970 to early 1971. So it began with the removal of 40 books bought by the school librarian, Mrs. Vaughan Taylor, about Southeast Asia and particularly Vietnam, as well as objection to the wearing of moratorium badges on school grounds. After the books, which Smith claimed had a leftist bias, were removed, a prefect of the school wore the moratorium badge as a protest against library censorship, leading to his suspension. Smith took the view that the moratorium badge would divide the school, asserting that students wore the badges because they were being manipulated by protest organisations. The Australian newspaper, which by 1970 was presenting a less jingoistic view of the Vietnam War, reported on the 16th of April that, quote, teachers at several Sydney high schools have been barred from distributing pamphlets or wearing political button badges distributed by the Vietnam moratorium organisers. This also included Manly Boys High School, where Headmaster Crumlin suspended 3 students for wearing a moratorium badge. And one student, 16-year-old Michael Cook, insisted that he was being discriminated against because both teachers and other students continued to wear the same badge. As a result, teacher at the school, Ray Gardner, was asked to remove the badge, which he refused because, in his words, to me, it was a personal, non-political thing. And besides, there were at least half a dozen other teachers at the school wearing them openly. On the same day, 16th of April 1970, the Sydney Morning Herald revealed that the issue over badges had spread to Fort Street Boys High School and Castle Hill High School. One student from Castle Hill saying to reporters, "There are a group of students who feel something should be done about the Vietnam War. I cleaned my bag because scholarships are at stake here," a point that will become important later on. "But I will continue distributing leaflets outside the school." 2 days later, on the 18th of April 1970, it was reported in the Canberra Times that Mr. N. Bardwell, a teacher at St. Patrick's College and ALP nominee for the seat of Goulburn, resigned after being asked to remove his moratorium badge while teaching. The New South Wales Minister for Education, Charles Cutler, responded to the broader badge issue by repeating his view that party politics should not be discussed in schools. And the Sydney Morning Herald said that he was expected to take a strong stand against teacher participation in moratorium activities in schools. In a press statement, the Teachers Moratorium Group objected to the intimidation of student and staff wearing protest badges in schools, insisting that it's not the badges that are introducing politics into schools, as party politics are already there through the dangerous tendency, in their words, within the school cadet corps of presenting military material to schoolboys as a life adventure. The Teachers Moratorium Group said, "Today's senior school students are not little children to be protected from public controversies. They are nearing the age where they can be conscripted and will soon have to vote. They are required to read widely, exercise judgment, and think clearly about current matters." I think that we've heard something very similar recently about school students engaged in climate protests. These events warranted official comment by the New South Wales Vietnam Moratorium Campaign, who wrote a letter to all high school principals, who had written a letter on the 16th of April 1970 to say that they were, quote, "very disturbed by press reports during the last few days concerning intimidatory action by some secondary school principals against students and teachers wearing moratorium badges. The Moratorium Secretariat believes that any such intimidatory action represents a serious threat to the civil liberties of secondary teachers and the students they teach. The Vietnam Moratorium campaign highlighted the prominence of official thinking in schools, maintaining in their letter that every secondary school principal has a responsibility to facilitate and promote the free and open discussion of all matters of public contention within the school environment. And they said that if they impeded such discussion, they could be inviting legal action by parents of the students involved. The suspension of Robert Colley, along with 3 other boys at Ibrox Park after Anzac Day of the 25th of April, amplified the controversy. Principal Smith justified the suspension by saying that the badge had to be banned because it was sourced from an outside organisation, to which Colley argued that the badge was a symbol of an event and a statement of his personal conviction and conscience. Despite this, Colley agreed to remove the badge as long as the rule about badges was reconsidered. However, Smith decided the ban would remain. As school vice captain and winner of the Special School Award, Colley was a high achiever and evidently popular amongst students. The day after his suspension, 40 students were prompted to buy and wear moratorium badges. The Tribune, which, I need to say that the Tribune is the Communist Party of Australia paper, so they were reporting on this a lot more than any other paper for reasons that I'm sure we can understand. They wrote on the 6th of May that the New South Wales Department of Education was yet to respond to his and the range of other suspensions occurring across the state. But in their words, many other principals and teachers believe the suspensions are foolish and unjustified. They also reported that, quote, many students say they are entitled to express their concern about a war for which in a very few years they may be conscripted. And as we can see, so this was 2 days, 6th of May 1970, 2 days before the first moratorium, and we can see that walkouts, other protests continued to occur after the first moratorium. On the 20th of May 1970, the Tribune again drew attention to the contradictory positions taken by the New South Wales Department of Education over badge wearing. The issue over moratorium badges at Fort Street Boys High School had led to the suspension of 5 students for refusing to remove badges they were wearing, one of these being David Colley, Robert's younger brother. Following David's suspension and 3 days before the 8th of May moratorium, several parents had made protests in person, leading to the lifting of all 5 Fort Street suspensions by military directive. Following these events, all 5 boys continued to wear the badges when they returned to school at Fort Street. But the department didn't comment on the Robert Colley issue at Ibrox Park, and the decision appeared to be supported by the Education Minister Cutler, despite having lifted suspensions at another school. On the 25th of May 1970, the New South Wales Teachers Federation interviewed Ibrox Park Principal Smith, reminding him that the Federation had carried a resolution in April that, quote, students in school should not be prevented from wearing the moratorium badge and that no student or teacher should be subject to embarrassment or discrimination for doing so. Despite this meeting, the situation at Ibrox Park became more serious in early June, and this was sort of over the space of a week. On the Friday, 5th of June, Teachers Moratorium Group members demonstrating outside the school were accosted by the pro-war teacher, school teacher, Mr. Caffrey, who ripped up leaflets they were distributing on the Colley issue and on the removal of the library books back in April, which was the month before. He chased one woman across the road while shouting, "Right, boys, let's rumble the commie trash." The school's librarian, Mrs. Vaughan Taylor, was also continually subjected to a barrage of insults by Caffrey, who, according to the Tribune, describes himself as the spokesman for the silent majority of the staff. So this was Friday, the 5th of June. On the Monday, the 8th of June, teachers were told by Smith, afraid that dissenting teachers would leak information to the press, that they were not allowed to make phone calls during working hours. On Tuesday, the 9th of June, Smith informed students that a televised protest demonstration was to take place outside the school that same afternoon, which prompted 4 boys to hold placards reading "No fascism in schools," leading to the suspension of 2 boys and a warning to 1 other. On Wednesday, the 10th of June, students, teachers and parents took action by demonstrating outside the Department of Education offices. These kinds of protests continued in the following months as well, as we can see here. And we can see also that they were, it sparked protests about other issues too. In an article published in the Tribune on the 24th of June, Colley's mother, Barbara, wrote that she and parents of the other suspended boys, we have been accused of being divisive. May I point out that Ibrox Park Boys High School is now more divided than it ever would have been if Robert had been left alone to wear his badge as the quiet act of conscience that it was. It is not the badge that is divisive, but the high-handed and undemocratic manner in which it has been treated. The Teachers Moratorium Group agreed in a June press statement. The reality is that these same students who may not express their moral convictions by wearing a moratorium badge will probably be able to vote next year. And they were referring to incoming changes to the voting age from 21 to 18, which was passed through an amendment to the Electoral Act in 1973. They wrote, the Teachers Moratorium Group wrote, the whole question of objection to the badge as political and objection to politics in schools can be reduced to the simple point that although the wearing of the badge in opposition to the war is in many cases on moral grounds, it has been dubbed as political, simply because the Liberal government supports our involvement in the war. Perhaps representing those who feared politicisation in schools in this way was former editor of the Bulletin and then editor of Quadrant and later Liberal leader of the opposition in New South Wales, Peter Coleman, who in September 1970 published School Power in Australia, Is Your Child Being Manipulated by Political Operators?, which is the subject of an amusing write-up in University of Newcastle. I'm in Newcastle, New South Wales, sorry, to New South Wales, University of New South Wales, their student magazine, which criticises his lack of analysis, among other things. Somehow he wrote this book and he put together all of the information he could find on protesters in high schools and protest groups in high school, and somehow has created this fantastic resource for us now about all of these groups. The issue received more attention from late 1970 when the New South Wales Department of Education used their powers to influence the future employment opportunities of some of the students involved. Robert Colley was refused a teacher's training scholarship in November 1970 by the New South Wales Education Department on the claim that they did not think he would be cooperative, despite gaining a Commonwealth scholarship based on excellent examination results. On the 6th of February 1971, the New South Wales Teachers Federation strongly, this is a quote, strongly condemned the refusal of a teacher training scholarship to Robert Colley and called on the Minister for Education to rescind the decision. And they called it clearly discriminatory, politically motivated, and contrary to the long-held belief of the Federation. The persons engaged in teaching within the public education system must have full civil rights without fear of discrimination or persecution. They stated there can only be one reason for his rejection, his involvement in moratorium activities, and wrote that rejection for a scholarship on such grounds establishes a dangerous precedent and a serious threat to the civic and professional rights of teachers and students. In response, Robert Colley said, I'm sure the staff and students of my school would not have elected me class captain, prefect, and school vice captain if any of these charges were true, nor would I have been given the school prize for service and cooperation. On the 25th of November 1970, the Canberra Times had reported that this issue was not isolated to Ibrox Park, as a student from an unnamed Sydney Girls High School was similarly refused a teacher's training scholarship, concluding that since the letter refusing her application did not mention her academic record at all, it must have been connected to her involvement with the moratorium. Despite the protests of a large range of groups in support of the democratic right of students and teachers to broadcast their anti-war views, recrimination actions by political authorities in response to badge wearing as a symbolic action taken in opposition to the war demonstrates the power of such acts. So now I'm going to move on to the use of silence, the strategic use of silence or absence to express opposition to the war. Although the activist presence is crucial to a successful social movement, silence or absence can also be strategically used to attract attention to a specific cause. Sutton writes that activist bodies convey political ideas, demand changes, and exert pressure. During the Vietnam War, protesters in New South Wales used their presence, voices, and words to spread the message, but these were also withdrawn in certain contexts to create meaning that was similarly impactful. The strategic placement of bodies during silent vigils and attendance in courtrooms or other law enforcement settings was used by protesters in New South Wales to achieve various movement aims. In some cases, drawing attention to the cause involved removal of bodies or absence through actions such as strikes or walk-offs by workers. Although silent vigils can be seen as akin to loud protest, as some of their public-facing intentions overlap with the traditional rally or march, the inclusion of the silent body creates impact by presenting a counterpoint to popular perceptions of activists as unruly or disreputable. Silent vigils were favoured from the early years of Australian involvement in Vietnam by religious groups. So in Canberra, this was in Sydney, but Methodist Reverend Alan Walker's Committee for Canberra Vigil, which also included 19 ministers from a range of religions, held its first event at Parliament House on the 20th of May 1965 to bring the government's actions before the bar of public conscience. The committee, which was based at 138 Castlereagh Street in Sydney, invited as Christian citizens men and women from every part of Australia who share our convictions to join with us in an act of silent witness before the federal Houses of Parliament. Others also became involved in silent vigils throughout the war. For example, Francis Carroll, Catholic Bishop of Wagga Wagga, who marched with a young Christian students group for peace in 1970, a daring move in the face of influence within Australian Catholicism of the decidedly pro-war National Civil Council headed by B.A. Santamaria. The silent vigil was also effectively used by the predominantly middle-class women of Save Our Sons from 1965, who gathered outside army depots while conscripts were being inducted, amongst other places. Silence combined with the presence of the respectable woman towards a movement which was publicly characterised by unruliness and violence was an intentional tactic and created a significant impact. In Sydney, 2 overlapping organisations were specifically set up during the war to hold silent vigils. The Vigil Organising Committee, which was initially called the Vigil Committee, and Vietnam Candlelight Vigil. The Vigil Committee held an all-night protest vigil on the 20th of April 1966, the night before the state's first conscripts were to march in Sydney before being sent to Vietnam. Information released to the public before the vigil clarified the target of the protest to prevent negative publicity in the media, positioning protesters against soldiers and their families. They said, this protest is not directed against members of the armed services or relatives and friends who may be shortly assembling to wish them a safe and speedy return. Our protest is directed against the federal government's Vietnam policies, especially its military commitment of 20-year-old conscripts. There were various other silent vigils throughout the war, many more than can be mentioned here, but the vigil, as some examples, the Vigil Organising Committee instituted a weekly silent vigil in Wynyard Park every Wednesday at lunchtime from 1966, which was supported by a range of organisations, including ESHRA, which was mentioned earlier. And the silent vigil was carried over to the moratorium period. So one event was a silent vigil in Hornsby Shopping Centre from 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. on Saturday, the 12th of September, a week before the second moratorium. And this was promoted by religious ministers, the Catholic David Malik and Congregationalist John Gunson. The placement of silent activist bodies within the legal system was also an intentional tactic used by organisations such as Committee in Defiance of the National Service Act, the members of which signed a public statement of defiance against conscription, intentionally aiming to breach the Crimes Act with an aim to overload the courts and prevent the prosecution of draft evaders. Eventually, thousands of people signed. This is another huge story that I would love to talk about, but I don't have time to talk about today. But their presence in the courts is what's important here. Organisations such as Save Our Sons and the Vietnam Objectors Group were regular attendees in court cases involving conscripted young men who claimed conscientious objection. So their physical presence within courts was intended as a statement of opposition to conscription, one that can be seen as patently different than legal representation, which was another way that people protested quietly, free legal representation, or financial support for court costs. Conversely, the removal of activist bodies from spaces also communicated the anti-war message through traditional strikes or alternative forms of work stoppages, the latter being a relatively new tactic for the period. The strategic absence of bodies was used within several key unions, particularly maritime unions, that had connections with the Communist Party of Australia or the peace movement more broadly, most notably the Seamen's Union. So I'm going to go, this is going to be the last example that I raise. From the first announcement that combat troops would be sent to Vietnam in early 1965, the Building Workers Industrial Union called for their withdrawal, and the Waterside Workers Federation staged a 24-hour strike in Sydney Harbour to protest the war, holding up 37 ships in the process. However, only a relatively small number of unions had majority membership opposed to the war at this time. After the Seamen's Union, oh, now what's happened here? Move this forward. After Seamen's Union members refused to load and man 2 ships in 1966, the Boonaroo and Jeperet, because they contained material and weapons bound for Vietnam, the resulting standoff within the union movement led the federal government to intervene. On the 12th of May 1966, the Seamen's Union Federal Executive voted to refuse any request by the federal government to man the Boonaroo or any other ships carrying goods to Vietnam, believing that this essentially meant recruitment of civilian workers into the peace, not the peace effort, the war effort. Their decision was opposed by 6 other maritime unions operating from Sydney, including the Waterside Workers Federation, a union with long ties to the Communist Party and the peace movement. And the Waterside Workers Federation offered to provide workers to load the ship. Importantly, most Seamen's Union members were not opposed to manning the ship, but they were reluctant to break with union policy. The Australian Council of Trade Unions, eager to ensure that it didn't alienate influential pro-war unions, such as the Australian Workers' Union, called a meeting of 7 maritime unions to meet in Sydney. It became clear that the actions of the Seamen's Union was not supported by most unionists, and in fact only by the Victorian branch of the Shipwright and Constructors Association. Although in 1966 the Seamen's Union eventually conceded defeat and manned the ship, there was an escalation of this issue in February 1967 when Seamen's Union members walked off the Boonaroo, this time in Melbourne, after learning that it carried munitions bound for Vietnam. The ACTU ordered them to return to work, arguing that the presence of bombs did not constitute a valid point of opposition. After this was refused, the federal government decided for the first time to commission the Boonaroo for the Navy and installed a Navy crew. When in March, the Seamen's Union again refused to man the Jeperet in Sydney against ACTU orders and unsupported by all other maritime unions, the Minister for Labour and National Service labelled the action in his words, disloyal and un-Australian machinations of the communist leaders of the Seamen's Union, again ordering the ship be manned with a mixed Navy and civilian crew. Despite the official opposition to Seamen's Union action, continuing removal of activist bodies by unionists continued to occur in various Australian states, including a 2,600-strong walk-off by waterside workers in Sydney over the suspension of a worker for refusing to load bombs onto the Jeperet in September 1967. Although these type of larger actions by waterside workers did not continue continuously during the course of the war, the series of events in the mid-1960s suggests that the absence of worker bodies constituted an effective expression of opposition to the war. And these were not the only work walk-offs that were recommended or occurred during the war. It's important to note also that ships have also been a focus of the current protests in relation to Palestine, particularly in Victoria, but that's, again, a story for another lecture. So to conclude, bodies were used in a range of ways beyond the traditional rally or march, or even beyond more technically productive forms of quiet protest. Bodies were used as a text by some protesters to appeal to general audiences who may not have yet established an anti-war stance and to raise funds in the process, or in some cases to affirm the respectability of the protest movement. The wearing of protest on activist bodies was also able to advance the anti-war message through the visual impact of badges, armbands, or other garb, as well as through the dramatic ways that some authority figures responded to such items. silence and absence were also able to disrupt both public understandings of the anti-war protester as well as the tangible system of war making. This paper has only touched on some uses of the activist body throughout the Vietnam War, but even just these demonstrate that relatively minor bodily acts can have a significant impact on social movements. In a time when larger scale or bolder protest acts are increasingly criminalized, this is a reminder that minimalism in protest can achieve results. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Effie. What a terrific amount of work you've done while you've been a fellow at the library. Now, if you were here from the beginning, you would have seen my very excited, slightly flustered introduction. I'm so keen for 2024, but I completely forgot to invite everybody to ask questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom, but you are all professionals, so your questions have started to come through. So thank you for that. And the first one is one that you touched on earlier in your talk, Effie, and then you brought that in at the end in that final slide. And this idea of schools and climate protest. So the question is around how much of this way that we use badges and we use our bodies, our presences and our absences, how much of that do you think is instinctive? Because we're not sort of really imagining Year 7 students schlepping down to the library and researching how they did it during the Vietnam War. So where are those examples coming from? Or do you think that a lot of this stuff is actually just a natural way to voice our opinion?
I think that it is a natural way to some extent. Now, what I'm just about to say, I can't claim, because this is from Sarah Madison and Sean Skarma's book, Activist Wisdom, and they talk about how this wisdom is carried down from activists, from Vietnam and earlier as well, because Vietnam and younger anti-Vietnam War activists got their cues from people who had been involved in the peace movement for a long time, quite often. And this sort of it's usually by word of mouth, because they're not going to go into libraries and read the documents, because who has time for that? And so it gets, they'll see images of protest perhaps online, on TikTok, these high school students. I don't know, I'm not, obviously not a high school student. So I think that to a huge extent, they're tried and true ways in their minds, I guess. But the fact is, I don't want to say that these high school students are amazing now during the climate protest, because they have, from what I can see, have used so much initiative. It's not as if their parents, even though this has been the claim that their parents are pushing them towards what they're doing, this has come from their ideas, and ideas that protesters couldn't have had during Vietnam, because it's a completely different generation. So, but I think also there would be the influence of older people in their lives that would say, oh, well, this is something that works. Oh, we marched against Iraq. Maybe this will work.
So somebody, no pressure, Effie, somebody's already asking, where and when will your research be published?
Well, I can't say, but let's just put it this way. I have a whole book mapped out. And what I've talked about today is part of one chapter. And there's so much. I can't even express how much State Library of New South Wales has that taught me about all of this. I knew that I would find examples of quiet protest. I didn't think I would find as much as I did from the quietest protesters, which are usually very elderly people who couldn't get involved but would write in and send money or say, I want to be involved, or I was involved in this movement and this movement, but I'm too old now, but I'll do whatever I can, to people who could, stage walk-offs and things like that. So anyway, I can't give a definite answer, but let's just say I'm hoping that it will be a book that I would try not to make 300,000 words long.
It's definitely coming. Someone's asking more specifically about the badges and how they could be interpreted. So you mentioned, Effie, that the badges were a low-risk way to be a part of these protests. Did you find anything that you would say tipped over into slacktivism? That's a great term.
Yes,
used to diminish protest movements that occur largely online. And this questioner is using as an example the moratorium T-shirts. So did they become a fashion item rather than a protest item?
That's so interesting. I think that the moratorium badges definitely, I can say that rather than the T-shirts. There was less mention of T-shirts and more about badges, and perhaps this was because of the cost and also because they're easy to transport. I'm not sure. But slacktivism, I think that I was, as you were reading out that question, Rachel, I was thinking about, because these smaller moratorium groups that formed, they were very active. So there were just all these little centers of, it was across the state. It was, and if we looked at other states, I'm sure it would be the same. Just these people who dedicated so much of their time to all this very dull stuff. Anyway, but in some of the records, some very clever women, I should say, have kept very dull letters from people sent in, registration slips, things like that. And on those, there were, yes, I know that you've asked me to do this. I can wear a badge and I can give out a couple of leaflets, but I have my daughter's wedding next weekend, so I can't. Or I've got a barbecue. I've got a barbecue on the weekend of the moratorium. I can't do this. I can't see that, I'm sure there were people that were like, I just can't be bothered. But the people who wrote in, and understandably so, they're writing into a protest organization, they're not going to say, I can't be bothered, were saying, I really want to be involved. This is what I can do. I'm older. I can't give out leaflets, but like, here's some money. Or I've got my daughter's wedding. I'll wear the badge,
That's quite interesting, isn't it? It's quite a gendered response. Women have been raised traditionally to not say no and to be helpful when somebody asks for help, especially when there's an ethical imperative behind that. So it's kind of interesting. I can't do X, but there are the other things that I can do. So I'm not quite saying no, but I'm still not doing all of the things that might be asked.
There was one student who said, I'm in the final year of my degree, my parents have banned any protest activities. I can't get involved. These letters were amazing, actually.
We have heaps of questions coming in. We'll try and get through a couple more. Some people are talking about the leaders of the climate protests and linking the history of current student activists to a lineage of those high schools that were also quite active during Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
So that's really fabulous.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Someone's saying it would be great to get a taster of your next paper on the theme of a disobeying the Crimes Act as an act of protest. Is it quiet or not so quiet? Can one quietly defy law on a public question?
Oh, that's such an interesting question.
That's a great question.
I'm glad that you've asked a question about the statement of defiance, the statement of defiance, because this group was amazing and I have written up this whole thing on them, but just didn't have time to talk about it today. But essentially a small group of people, academics, other activists from organizations. I wouldn't say that they were exclusively New Left. They were mainly older, middle-aged and older people. And then it expanded, got together and signed this statement of defiance. And eventually it turned into 8,000 people across the country who were essentially had to be tried in court. And the government, the authorities stopped, just started giving them fines, but then they would not pay the fines because they said, no, we want to be in court, because then they thought, well, if we stretch the legal process, it means that all of the draft evaders can't be tried because all of the time of the courts will be spent trying us and we don't care. So the question about whether that's quiet or not so quiet, I think the signing of the statement of defiance is quiet, but obstructing the legal system is definitely not quiet. It's not a rally. It's not getting involved in a rally or a march. It's not, holding a banner, but it's sitting there in a courtroom and speaking. So you're not always silent, I guess. Although your lawyer will be speaking for you, I imagine.
Your name is there, and just by having your name inscribed in the record in that way is quite That's quite brave. That's not terribly quiet, is it?
But what I find really surprising about this, you know, I've been studying the Vietnam War for a little while, you know, I did my PhD on it. The Statement of Defiance is something that, you know, I thought 8,000 people, because I found all of this in the State Library of New South Wales archive. And, you know, there's a few things in other places, of course. There's a lot of material in there about it. And I thought to myself, why has this not been the subject of many, many things? This is a massive action during the war. Why is it? So it does have the potential to be not so quiet, but for some reason it's been quietened. And I think that's a lot of the sort of aim of the research, to show that this actually isn't, it's quiet, it's been quietened, but because there's been this projection of the protester as someone who's out in the street causing a mess, but actually it's these people of all ages who are doing various different things. And, you know, just that's the aim of protest, to disrupting things in many, many different ways. I'm not really answering your question, Maria. I'm so sorry. I'm just ranting at this stage.
No, it's a great response. And we saw some of it in Scott McKinnon's research when he was talking about the decriminalisation of homosexuality as part of his Nancy Keesing fellowship a few years ago, about how people tried to clog the court system as a way of defiance and protest and forcing people to have a conversation about why we're here and should this really be illegal. But yeah, it's interesting how we usually focus, as you suggested, on the rally or on the petition, those really core tools of the protesters' kit box. But you've done such a wonderful job looking across a huge range of collections to find all these other forms of protest that are kept here at the library. I want to end off, I know the clock is ticking, but I want to end by sharing an anecdote that someone has sent through. I don't normally read out comments, but this one was particularly good. As a youngish high school teacher at a school with a very activist student population, so Wollongong being strongly union and anti-war, we were limited in our actions by threats that our probation not be passed if we were too activist. So interesting how protest, whether it's wearing a badge or a colour scheme or really openly defiant with a megaphone at the head of a rally, it all comes with some sort of risk. And it's interesting to hear about how you're sort of saying that even the lower risk ways to protest can have personal repercussions.
Yes.
So thank you very much for all of that and your questions. We had such a lovely audience today. Please join us next time. So Dr. Kelly Lua will be sharing her research on Elsie's Refuge, which was the first women's refuge in Australia. Kelly is a lecturer with the School of Nursing at the University of Wollongong, and in 2019, as part of a program of research that she was undertaking to look in the impacts of intimate partner violence in Australia, she was a visiting scholar here at the library, and I have not seen her since she actually completed that research those years ago. So it will be wonderful to have her back. So that's Tuesday, the 5th of March at 11 a.m. Bookings for her free online talk are open now. So I do hope to have your company on site at the library or online at our next talk. Until then, thank you very much for coming and stay safe, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Effie.